Greetings everyone, I'm Kevin, and here are 30 books that I hope to read before I turn 30. In September, I turned 25, so I only have 5 years left before I turn 30, so I thought to myself, what better way to celebrate turning 25 than dreading becoming 30? So here are 30 books that I hope to finish in the next 5 years. And we're going to go through these books in no particular order. So the first book that I want to read is Brave New World. This is a science fiction classic, and because I am a science fiction nerd, I feel like this is definitely a book that I should read at some point in the next 5 years. And then another classic that is kind of sci-fi is 1984 by George Orwell. This is a book that a lot of people have known about. Like, you have heard about this book most likely. And both this and Brave New World kind of has to do with dystopian societies and controlling. I am a firm believer that we can always learn from the past and from like thoughts that was in the past and like how people viewed the future. I find that very interesting. So this is another book that I want to read before I'm 30. Then we have a few authors that I want to read from, and not specific books, but more like these are authors that I feel like I have to read these authors at some point in my life. So why not put them in 30 before 30? And these authors are Agatha Christie. I grew up watching Miss Marple and Poirot and other kind of movies and TV adaptations based on her stories and her characters. So like that was something that I grew up with, and like murder mysteries are a big thing in Sweden. Like it's extremely common to read murder mysteries, or any kind of crime fiction is a very popular genre here. And I grew up watching these cozy Agatha Christie movies that were murder mysteries, and I really enjoyed those. So I feel like I definitely want to read an Agatha Christie book sometime in my life before I'm 30. The next author that I feel like I should read is Stephen King. I am kind of dreading it because his books are long and usually horror. Two things that I don't like, and putting them together, yeah, but I want to challenge myself because I feel like I want, as someone who loves reading, I want to be able to say, I have read a Stephen King book. I want to be able to say that and never feel like I have to pick up another Stephen King book. Like, I have read one book, it's fine, it's done. I can check that off the bucket list. Then another author that I have on this is Haruki Murakami. But Haruki Murakami is an author that a lot of people know. He is a Japanese author. I don't know if he writes in Japanese or if he writes in English. Like, I don't know that much about him. I just know that he has written some very strange books. Like, the only books that I have heard from him have been strange in some way, which isn't something that I'm against. It's just not, I haven't found a book by him that I felt intrigued by, that I felt like I want to read this book. But I still feel like he is definitely an author that I want to be able to say that, yeah, I have read from him. I have read one of his books, and maybe, who knows, maybe I will love the book that I read and I want to read more. I don't know. But he's definitely an author that I want to have read. And the last author is Astrid Lindgren. I do have a book by her, but it's a children's book and it's illustrated. And even though it's written by her, I don't really see it as a book by her. Like, she has written these beautiful children's books that are kind of like novel length, middle grades, you know? And I read those. I have read a few of her books when I was younger, and I grew up watching the movies, a lot of movies and TV shows based on her world. And I've also visited her world, like that kind of theme park that is in Sweden. I visited that as well. So I do really want to read a book for like nostalgia. And as an adult, I feel like I would get a lot more from reading a book by her because those books are very old. The settings are a long time ago, in my opinion. Like, for me, these books are set in a Sweden that I didn't grow up in because it was like several decades before I was even born. So I feel like I will see societal differences and maybe like class differences that don't exist today but did back then. I don't know. So those things I feel like I can maybe pick up on as an adult reading her books. The next book I was kind of going back and forth with because it's To Kill a Mockingbird, and a part of me is very like, yes, I want to read this. It's a classic that is extremely popular. Like, people do analysis of this specific book in universities around the world and in high school as well, and I have never read it. I have heard things about this book that makes me dread reading it because it's sad. From what I understand, it's pretty tragic, and I don't like tragic books. I say, and I love Shakespeare play. But I feel like this is kind of the same way as with Stephen King, that I want to say that I have read this book. Both as a teacher, an English teacher, and a reader, I want to be able to say this book that a lot of people talk about, and that is a classic that is still read worldwide. I want to read that book as well. And then we have 1001 Nights by Hanan Al-Shaikh, and this is kind of like a collection of stories from like the Arab world, and like the Middle East tales and folklore and things like that. There are a few stories of this from this that I grew up with, so I feel like I'm really excited to read this, but I haven't yet. I haven't had like the opportunity, hasn't arrived yet. But this is definitely a book that I feel like I want to read this before I'm 30. Like, I want to read this in the next 5 years because it's that kind of book that is kind of a classic, but it's not a classic because these stories are retold in our contemporary, you know, our contemporary time, but they're still bound to the past. I don't know how to explain that, but this is definitely like a classic. This is kind of like a classic collection, or a collection of classic stories. Yeah. Then we have another classic, and it's 100 Years of Solitude. And this is one of the greatest magical realism books there has ever been. And I am not really that into magical realism. Like, I have enjoyed every magical realism, or the majority of the magical realism books that I have read, I have enjoyed. But like, this is both a classic book, and it's a book that a lot of like people with Latin American heritage love and like look back on as part of the heritage, and, you know, classic book from South America. Like, him and Isabel Allende are both big magical realism authors. So 100 Years of Solitude is a book that is recommended a lot if you want to read magical realism, and so I feel like it's another one of those books that I want to have read. The next book is another one that I feel a little, yeah, I want to have read this book, but I'm dreading reading it. And it's The Book Thief. This book is tragic, and it's set during World War II. Like, I have talked about my own feelings and my own experiences with World War II like a few times on this channel, but because of, you know, not great experiences connected to learning about World War II as being the only person in class who was German and Swedish. Yeah, so like, people can, like, kids can be extremely mean, but I still have that kind of like within me that I know that someone in my family, my great grandpa, was involved, and that makes it kind of like difficult for me to read books about World War II because I keep thinking like maybe he did this too. And so I feel like reading The Book Thief, I will feel like that as well, that maybe these are things that my great grandpa did as well at that time because he was involved. So that's kind of why I'm dreading it, and also because it's tragic and I don't like tragic books, as I said earlier in this video. But it's that kind of book that I feel like as a literature lover and as an English teacher, I have to have read this book at some point. So why not before I'm 30? Then we have another book that I feel the exact same way with, and it's The Lord of the Flies. Moving on to 3 books that are technically one book, but they are also technically 3 books, and it's Dante's Divine Comedy. This is divided into Dante's Inferno, Dante's Purgatory, and Dante's Paradise. So even though I have 1 book, I count this as 3 books. So Dante's Inferno is the one that most people talk about when they talk about the Divine Comedy, but I want to read all 3 parts, and because they are classically viewed as 3 separate pieces, part of the same story, I count them as 3 different books. So we have 3 books here that I want to read. I am really I have been wanting to read this for such a long time now, that I have read bits and pieces of this that I have really enjoyed and that I have analyzed, but I haven't read it in its entirety yet. The next we have another 2 books that are part of a series, and it's Percy Jackson and the Battle of the Labyrinth, which is the 4th Percy Jackson book. I don't remember if it's the 3rd or the 4th. I don't remember how many books is in the Percy Jackson series. I own the 1st book. I want to own the entire series at some point. I really want to own the entire series. I have read 2.5 books. I have finished the first 2 books, really enjoyed them. Then I read half the 3rd book before I had to return it to the library, and it's been 6 years since I read them. So I reread the 1st book last year, I would say last year, and so I want to reread the other books. But the only books that I haven't finished are Battle of the Labyrinth and The Last Olympian. So those are 2 books that I want to read so that I can say that I have finished the Percy Jackson series. Then we're moving on to another book that I kind of grew up with, and it's Angels and Demons. I grew up with the movie. I remember when it came out and was this big thing, and my family loved it, and we rewatched it several times. I can sit here, I haven't watched the movie in 10-15 years, and I can still tell you the plot of it. I can still tell you key scenes in the movie because I watched it so many times when I was younger. And when I found out that it was based on a book, I was like, I have to read the book. So I have to read the book. So that's why it's on here. I am really excited to read the book, and then I want to rewatch the movie and see which is better, because of course. The next book is another book that I am dreading, and it's Pride and Prejudice. I feel like with this book, I want to say that I have read it as, I'm going to say this a lot, as a reader, as an English teacher, but also as a romance lover. This is the kind of book that you should read. Not that you should read, but that a lot of people have read and have enjoyed. And it's kind of like a classic in the way that I feel like I want to be able to say that I've read Pride and Prejudice. I don't like the movie, I didn't really like the TV show, but maybe I will love the book, I don't know. But it's on here because I feel like I want to be able to say that I have read Pride and Prejudice in full. Then we're moving on to another classic that I should read because it's a science fiction classic, and it's 2001: A Space Odyssey. This is just another book that I am really excited to read because it is a science fiction classic, and I think it's very interesting that I have 1 book that I want to read that is a classic, and it's 1984, which was far into the future for them, and then another book, 2001, which was so far into the future for them. And I'm like, I lived 40 years after 1984, and I lived 20 years after 2001. So I think that's very interesting how they thought that our society would be years ago, decades ago from where I live, my contemporary time. So I think that's very interesting. And this has to do with space travel, I think, which I love space travel. So I am really excited to read 2001: A Space Odyssey. That's a very cool name. Then there's another science fiction that I feel like is a classic by this point, but it's a contemporary classic, and it's The Martian by Andy Weir. I have heard great things about this book that I feel like I want to read this, and I'm also very interested in reading his most recent book, Hail Mary, or Project Hail Mary. Like, I think that sounds very interesting, like the whole premise of that book, but also the premise of The Martian I think sounds very interesting, and I want to read that book as well. And then we have two books that I have in one book, and it's A Restaurant at the End of the World and Life, the Universe, and Everything, which are the second and the third story in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series. So this is a trilogy of 5, which I think sounds very funny. But those are the next stories that I haven't read in full. Like, I read 70% of the second, and then it just went too far and I forgot what happened. And so I didn't finish. So I want to finish the second, and I want to read the third. I think I'm going to read all of them, but I didn't want to put in the fourth and the fifth in case I wouldn't be able to get to them for one reason or another. But the second and the third story I want to read. So there are a lot of science fiction classics on here because I love science fiction, and science fiction classics I feel have, like, they give me a lot more than classic romance. Like, romance and science fiction are my two favorite genres. Like, they are neck and neck. Like, I can't pick a favorite between those two. But when it comes to classics, I would much rather pick up a science fiction classic than a romance classic. I'm just not really interested in the olden times. Then we have a book that is a book that I don't know if I have read or not. I don't remember. It's The God of Small Things. Like, I know that we read this for university, for English, for transatlantic, we have like a transatlantic module in English in university where we read books from across the Atlantic. And like, my professors were British. They were all English, to be specific. So transatlantic was both reading books from the US, not from Canada, but from the US, from India, and from Oceania. Like, we read Potiki for New Zealand because of like the Maori, but we read this for India, or I don't remember if we read this for India. And we read Disgrace for South Africa, which I did finish, and we did read The Lowland, which I also read, but I don't remember if I read this or not. I know that I have a grade for an analysis on this book, but I have no memory of actually reading it. And that's why it's on my read shelves and not my TBR shelves. I've just gotten so used to thinking that, yeah, I have read this book, but I have no memory of actually reading the book. And like, of course, I have to have read this because I did write an analysis of this book and I don't cheat. So I must have read this. But because I don't remember it, I want to bring this up here because this is a book that I want to read, and I want to read this and remember it before I'm 30. And the last book that I have a physical copy of is Swimming in the Monsoon Sea, because this is the book that has been on my shelves the longest without being read. I think I have attempted to read this 5 times, but for one reason or another, I haven't been able to finish it. I think the longest I made into the book was 50%. Like, I made it halfway through. I really enjoyed the story. I really enjoyed the whole, like, the setting of Sri Lanka in the 1980s. I also really enjoyed the whole, like, making of the Othello Shakespeare play. Like, I really enjoyed all of those aspects, but I just wasn't in the right headspace that I couldn't manage to read this book physically. That I feel like the times that I have attempted to read this, I should have had it as an audiobook, but it's not It doesn't have an audiobook anywhere. So if it had, I would probably have finished it by now. But because I have to read this physically and I haven't been in the right mental space that I could read a book with my eyes the way that I needed to when I picked this up, like back when I attempted to read this. Like the chapters are kind of long, but they're not, you know, long. Like I read a book with a 90-page long chapter, which was not fun. Like I really enjoyed everything that I read in this. I really enjoyed, but it was just that me physically, I couldn't read it. But I really want to read it, and I want to get to that kind of like headspace where I feel like I can breeze through it, but it's the kind of like slow book that takes longer for me to get through reading with my eyes. Like it's the kind of book that I would much rather read as an audiobook. The next book that I want to read is The 100 Secret Senses. And this is a kind of classic. It's not a classic. It's old, like it's my age. This book is my age. It's from 95. I was born 96. So it's kind of my age. So I guess for this book, I'm not only going to attempt to read it before I turn 30, but also before the book turns 30, I guess. And this book is about a Chinese American family in like the past, because this was written in the 90s. So I assume this was set in like the 80s, maybe the 70s, but it follows a Chinese American family and the racism that they go through. And it's, from what I heard about this, is that it's a very like gripping book that has to do with identity and like who are you, and who determines who you are. Is it the people around you who call you names and tell you who you are according to them, or do you decide who you are? And there's like this whole thing with identity that I find very intriguing, because I love books that has to do with identity and finding yourself and figuring out who you are and standing up for yourself and all of that. And as someone who is multicultural and multinational and multilingual, a lot of multi, it always, like, it means a lot to me. Like, I relate a lot to immigrant stories because of, there are just like a lot of things that we have in common, that if you come from a family that escaped war, there are a lot of things that we have in common, that I feel like reading books about immigrant families, it doesn't matter where they fled from or what country they left, I relate a lot to it, because I know the struggle that my family went through, and I know the struggle that my family went through in Sweden as well. And I also relate a lot to, like, for my students and for friends that I have had who immigrated to Sweden through war. I relate to them a lot, because there are just certain things that you carry with you and carries in your family after going through something like that. Like, if you have a parent or a grandparent who went through that, like, it affects you. And like, my grandpa was a teenager when he came to Sweden, and that affected him, and he was always seen as German. And my family has had issues being German in, you know, school and things like that. Like I had teachers on me because I didn't speak proper Swedish. Like, I literally had teachers try to teach me Swedish pronunciation, because according to them, I spoke broken Swedish because I had German sounds that I got from my grandpa. And that is something, like, that whole thing is something that I relate a lot to with other immigrant stories and stories from other people with immigrant past, and like characters with immigrant background. Like, I relate to that. Like, I relate to the whole thing that people see you as one thing, and then when you're in that country, you're seen as another thing, and like, where do you really belong? And it's kind of like no country wants to claim you. It kind of feels like, you know, you have to find yourself and be content with who you are. And that's kind of like a reason why I wanted to add this book to this list because I feel like it will be such an important book to read for me, in like very gripping the whole identity thing and the whole multinational, multicultural, multilingual thing, and like what it's like to be seen as one nationality and one ethnicity in a country where that's not the norm. The next two books are the first and the second book in a series, and they are Fire from Heaven and The Persian Boy. And these are book 1 and 2 of Alexander the Great. And if you're new to this channel, hello, you probably don't know the fact that I am very interested in Greek mythology and ancient Greeks, because literally the only history that I studied in upper secondary school was ancient times. We went to ancient Rome and ancient Greece. Like, we didn't literally go there, but like that's what we studied in history class. So a year of history, only the ancient times in Rome and Greece. So I don't know history other than that from upper secondary school. And from like primary school, it was, you know, the 1900s and the Viking Age and the Stone Age. But very like, I think we had 1 week per era in primary school. Like, they didn't really go into it that much. And a few things about the old kings, but like not that much. But ancient Greece is the only era that I had like education focus on in school. So we had like this big, like, I think we went through ancient Greece in like 6 months, like for 1 whole semester was only ancient Greece. And so I think that's why I love learning about ancient Greece, because it's the only era that I actually know anything about, apart from a little things, like a few things in 1900s, but era wise, it's ancient Greece. And these books has to do with ancient Greece, and they are also Achillean, which is another thing that has to do with ancient Greece now that I thought about it. But it has a male-male romance or relationship in it, and like I'm just really excited to read anything that has to do with ancient Greece. But these two books I'm really excited to read. Then we have another classic, and just as I brought up Astrid Lindgren earlier in this video for like nostalgia and things, like I live in Sweden, I am Swedish, and reading Swedish classic children's books is something that I want to do. I also added Inkheart by Cornelia Funke, but Cornelia Funke is a German children's author, and I really want to read some of her books in German. Like, I feel like I am so excited to go back to Germany now that we have like looser restrictions. A lot of people in Sweden are fully vaccinated. I am fully vaccinated, and I'm really excited to go back to Germany. I don't know when I will be able to go back to Germany, but when I do, I am going to spend a lot of time and money in a bookstore, and I'm just like really excited to go to one of these, you know, cozy secondhand stores, because there are actually a lot of secondhand bookstores in Germany, in like some cities and some towns. So that is something that I really want to do. And then I want to pick up a few Cornelia Funke books, and one of them that I really want to read is Inkheart. And then we're going to end this little video list with 2 science fictions that are very different in a lot of ways. The first one is Dark Matter. I thought this was older than it is. It's 5 years old. It's from 2016. And this, what really like made me feel like I want to read this, even though it's a thriller, which is not really usually my cup of tea. I am really intrigued by the fact that there's this guy who is kidnapped, and his kidnapper asks him, "Are you happy with your life?" or something like that. And he wakes up in an alternate world where his life that he knew never happened. And he starts to kind of like struggling. He's struggling to figure out what reality was real and what reality was a dream or fake. Like, his wife isn't his wife. His child had never been born. So like, which reality is the right one, and I don't know where the story is going to go from there, and I'm really intrigued to find out. And the last book is Children of Time. I have been looking for this book, but it's, from what I understand, I can't find it anywhere. But I want to have this book because I'm really intrigued by this book. I really want to read it. It's about kind of like the last survivors of Earth are set off to a mission in space to find the new home planet. And it's kind of like intriguing because are they going to find a planet that is like planet Earth, or is it going to be a challenging planet? And the struggles of, you know, all of that. In space travel, it's a space opera. I love those things, so I'm really excited to read that book as well. And last thing, I just want to mention that, as you know, I didn't bring up that many books that I actually own. And the reason for that is because I read rather quickly. I have read over 130 books so far this year, which I know isn't a lot for a lot of people, and it's a lot for other people. But in my eyes, I do read quite a lot, and I don't have an issue getting to these books. Like, I own these books, which is why I want to read them. And these books that I brought up talking about are the books that I find more challenging that I do own. But I, like, all of the books that I actually own, I am going to read before I turn 30. And so I wanted to bring up books that I want to read but that I don't own, so that I also know, like, these books, I want to get these books, I want to get my hands on these books in one way or another before I turn 30 so that I can read them. Like, it's a way for me to kind of prioritize what books I want to read and what books I should not prioritize that way. It's kind of like that. But anyways, that was the 30 books I want to read before I turn 30. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave a like if you did and subscribe if you haven't. Until next time, good reading. Bye.